And that's where there's a lot of debate in the HCI community. I'm not going to go into that now because I think we could spend ages and I'm going to get confused myself. But in educational technology, I mean, people working in HCI and educational technology have started to develop a number of models as well. So this one from Kirchner and his colleagues, they've been using the concept of affordances for usability and utility studies. You know, is the system usable and is it useful, which is for learners an important thing. And they're discussing, they've identified the technological affordances, so provided by the platform or the system, social affordances, the situation, the communicative situation, and educational. And then you've also got Gronja Connell, that some of you may know, I think she's from the Open University. And I found that this, she talks a lot about pedagogical affordances. I mean, that's something she has on her blog. And I think those two models are very interesting. But at the end of the day, they're still based on Norman's definition of affordances. And I think for Cole, they do provide some very useful pointers for design and to look at the interactions that are taking place, either between the learner and the machine or between learners or learner and teacher and so on. But I don't think that for the language acquisition part of things, I don't think they go far enough. And I think what we need is something else. And this is where I think activity theory has a lot to offer. And there's a big, not just activity theory, I read a very interesting article not that long ago about somebody using Merleau-Ponty schéma corporel type of notion to look at affordances and saying it's not an affordance, it's not a potential for action, it's a potential for interaction, which would be very interesting for us to look at as well. Situated learning, I think offer a lot of possibility for that. But activity theory, for me, is quite, well, I'm a bit fanatic about it. It's a bit of a challenge to work in that area, and it's quite interesting. But I think it's quite powerful because it's one of those theories that kind of go away with the Descartes, and it's probably funny that it comes from a French person who's been brought up with the Descartes tradition of separation between mind and body. And I think activity theory goes against that. And ecological psychology, I think, goes against this dualism as well. So I think those theories are quite interesting, especially if you can bring them together. So there's different approach to activity theory. There's the Russian-Soviet approach, the pure Leontiev type of approach, and then there's more Western one that is embodied by Engelstrom and so on. I mean, they have a lot of they're very close, but on a philosophical, ontological thing, there are some differences. But both, I think, have some interesting things for us, because Berenson and Tredvik are using the Leontiev model, which really looks at the hierarchy of an activity system, looking at operations that are carried out, that are dependent on conditions, material conditions in the environment, actions that are carried out by individual or teams, and the activity, which is more the society level. And basically, the activity is driven by a motive. And the question is, why? Why is this taking place? The actions are far more kind of linear, and that they're goal-oriented, and it's what are we doing? And the operations would be dependent on the conditions, as I said, and answer the question, how do we do something? So these are the different constituents. And I'm going to go to, just check my email. And basically, this is, according to those authors, this is completely compatible with an ecological approach to perception, where the activity is really what makes the link between the subject, the agent, or whatever, and the object of the activity that drives what we do. So the only thing with that model is that, in that case, affordances are really talked about at the operations level. Talk about, and especially in terms of HCI, that's what Barretton and Trevi called operational affordances. So, the clicking, all those things that are automated by the system or whatever would happen at the operations. But the idea is to try, and this has been noted by other activity theories working in human HCI and interaction design, like Kaptelinin and so on, that activity theory needs to be expanded to look at affordances at the action and activity level. So one way of looking at it is what other people have done, like Kuzva and Richard, where they've used the Engelstrom's model. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. Basically, so I see some people are seeing triangles all over the place all the time. But this is basically an expansion of Leontief's model that Engelstrom did, way back. But what we don't always see in papers is the exchange, consumption, distribution, and so on, triangles in the middle, because this is really based on Marxist theories or whatever, and I think people shy away. But it is a very interesting model, because those little things, for me, that would be a way of looking at affordances from an activity theory perspective. An activity system which consists of, which has three levels, as we said, operation, action, and activity, is also divided into nodes or constituents. And basically the top triangle in terms of education, learning, language learning, is what Engelstrom would call the visible curriculum. Subjects, could be students or teams of students, are carrying out some actions on an object that's going to be transformed into learning outcomes, and this is mediated by artifacts, tools, and so on. But very often I think that in COL, and especially when we look at interactions, this is what we look at. We look at those actions, what happens there, what happens with the mediation, but we tend to ignore or forget about the bottom of the iceberg, which is the base, which is really the invisible curriculum, and that looks at all the rules, convention, and so on, that mediates the relationship between the subject, the object, the community, and also the division of labor, which is how people work together on all the power relationships and so on. Yeah? So looking at the affordances there, for me, would say that those triangle in the middle, consumption, production, exchange, distribution, which are kind of Marxist vocabulary or whatever, so it is a bit odd. But I mean, at the same time, I think it has some value. I think this is where we provide affordances. What are the exchange affordances that we provide, that the activity system provides, not just the system, the platform, I mean, of the thing. And one of the things is the question of contradiction. So as activity systems move or transform themselves, contradictions are going to emerge. And some of those authors are looking at those emerging contradictions to see where is the gap between the design that was done and what expected, and then what was actually realized by the learner. So if we look just to see how we could integrate that, because I know I'm really rushing through the theory because I probably don't have enough time to finish the flow. But how can we integrate this to look at design better interactions, or create, make it possible for affordances for interactions and learning to emerge as students engage in some language learning activities, and how can we integrate, analyze those interactions. So this is a very fictitious activity system, just to give you the terms, individual students or pairs of students, for instance, are working with a tool that we're designing in a different project called the Tandem tool, for instance, and they're attending to different, images, role plays, information gap exercises, and so on. Their actions are mediated by tools and artifacts. So those tools could be language, or the main one would be language, L2, but also L1. Methods, the Tandem tool, which is a platform we are developing at the moment, video conferencing tools, resources, and so on. There's rules about the task, but also about the assessment, about all the curriculum. The community is the language learning community that's working with them, and the division of labor, you have people working in pairs. The division of labor is horizontal, and then you have a power structure as well, sometimes with leaders or teachers and so on. Okay, that's a very kind of brief role. But this is not enough. I mean, how do you go about looking at the interactions that are taking place? So I think there's two different things. You could first, at what level? Because are you going to look at the microgenesis level, so the interactions moment to moment? Are you going to look at the full curriculum? And that's, I think, one of the major problems in using activity theory to analyze learning as it happens in groups. So this is kind of the macro, exo, meso, micro kind of ecological approach. And I think this is compatible with activity theory, and I've done that as well with a colleague of mine, Christina Harper, in the last year Calico article, is to really decide to decompose your activity system, according to ecological principles, because what happens at the moment-to-moment interaction at the micro level can only be understood if we know what happened below that level. That's the ecological principles, and what happens above. So isolating some interactions, you can describe, in my view, you can describe what happens, but you can't understand it completely, because its meaning is really depending on what happens above and below. So I think that's very important to make sure that we know how it relates to each other. And that links as well to another, I think, big issue, which is the idea of working across multiple time scales and spaces, but I'm not going to go into that now, but the idea of using Bakhtin's chronotope, for instance, is, I think, quite important, and the trajectory, activity time is not linear, it's cyclic, and action time is maybe linear. So I think that there's a lot of things there to look at. But I think when we look at the interactions, we need to be clear how it relates to other parts of the thing. The other thing as well is that, I know I didn't try to use Max because it never does what is also, if you look at the semiotic, the triangle I had before, this was very kind of vague, and 2 minutes, I'm nearly there. But I think one other way of looking at it is to look at looking at those different spaces, multiple spaces, and to have layers. And basically, you have your semiotic activity system, the Leo Van Lee one, the task or whatever. But it is also, there's also these technological layers, which can be separated for analysis purposes without ever losing sight that is other component as well. They're kind of linked. So you need to separate things at some point, but without losing sight of the other side of the coin. And when we talk about contradictions in activity theory, if you look at the subject of my learning activity is the student in my class or whatever, part of a blood and flesh community, but it's also a user of it's a technological user of a system as well. And sometimes there's tension. You should think about bringing your class to Second Life. You've got identity, different identities there. You've got the subject with me, like that, but there's also me and my avatar. We're not completely separate, but we're not completely identical either. So how do you marry those two? So I think, and so on for everything. The rules are the same. You're going to have rules that are imposed by the system, and that might hide some affordances that are created by your task, and vice versa. So I think we need to find ways of looking at both together and separate them to really see what's going on and understand the type of interactions. But more interesting, I think, is that we need a third layer, which is looking at